Welcome. Before we step into this disturbing true story, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because a lot of careful work goes into researching real historical records, forgotten testimonies, and hidden details to bring stories like this to light. What you're about to hear is not just shocking because of the age or the birth itself, but because of what it reveals about power, cruelty, and silence in 1854 Mississippi, a story history tried hard to bury. She had already lived longer than most people around her, long enough for her name to be worn thin by use and neglect. By the time she reached 72, her body carried the weight of decades spent bent under the sun, hands split from cotton stalks and wash tubs, knees swollen from years of kneeling on dirt floors. On the plantation, age was not honored. It was tolerated only if the body could still serve a purpose. She had outlived 3 plantation owners, buried children she was never allowed to keep, and watched younger women grow old before their time. Her hair had turned fully gray, her back curved like a question no one cared to answer, and many believed she would quietly die in one of the cabins without notice, the way so many did. She was known among the enslaved as Auntie, not as a sign of affection, but because age forced a kind of distance. The overseers no longer pushed her into the fields. Instead, she was given work inside, mending clothes, tending fires, rocking infants that were not hers. She moved slowly, deliberately, conserving what little strength remained. At night, she slept lightly, her body stiff with pain, her mind crowded with memories she never spoke aloud. Survival had taught her silence. Her age made her invisible in the eyes of power, and that invisibility was dangerous. On plantations, youth was exploited openly, but old age was exploited quietly. She was considered harmless, non-threatening, no longer a woman in the eyes of those who ruled the house. That assumption was the foundation of what followed. She had no protection, no witness, no voice that would be believed if she spoke. When commands came, they were obeyed not out of loyalty, but because disobedience carried consequences even the elderly could not escape. Among the enslaved community, she was respected for her endurance. Younger women sought her out for whispered advice about childbirth, about surviving grief, about how to endure what could not be escaped. She had delivered babies, cleaned blood from floors, and wrapped bodies in cloth when life slipped away. She had seen too much to be surprised by cruelty anymore. But she had not seen everything, not yet. Physically, her body showed every year it had lived. Her hands shook when she threaded needles. Her breath came short after climbing steps. Her monthly cycles had ended decades earlier, something the women understood, but never discussed openly. Childbearing was a young woman's burden, something she believed had long passed her by. She thought her body had been spared at least that final humiliation. In her mind, age was a shield, thin, fragile, but still a shield. The plantation itself had begun to change around her. The enslaver was old and ill, aware that his end was nearing. The house felt tense, restless, full of whispered conversations and unspoken fears. Power, when it senses its own end, often grows more reckless, not less. She noticed how the air shifted, how eyes lingered too long, how silence stretched uncomfortably after commands were given. Something felt wrong long before her body showed any sign of it. When the first symptoms appeared, she didn't understand them. Fatigue had been her companion for years, pain her daily language. But this was different. Her stomach tightened in unfamiliar ways. She felt waves of nausea she hadn't known since girlhood. At first, she assumed illness, maybe the beginning of death itself. She welcomed that thought quietly, believing it would finally bring rest. She told no one. Enslaved people learned early that drawing attention to the body only invited more suffering. As weeks passed, her condition worsened, not toward death, but toward something far more terrifying. Other women noticed the changes before she did. The way her abdomen hardened. The way her body swelled unnaturally for someone her age. The way she avoided eye contact, fear creeping into her movements. Whispers began, not out of gossip, but disbelief. No one wanted to say the words aloud. Pregnancy at 72 was unthinkable, impossible, against nature itself. Yet her body did not lie. Whatever shield age had given her shattered completely. She was no longer invisible. She became an object of fear, curiosity, and control. Doctors were summoned, their faces tight with confusion and suspicion. The enslaver's household reacted not with concern for her life, but with shock at what her body represented. She was no longer just an old woman nearing death. She was proof of something deeply disturbing, something that could not be explained away without exposing truths no one wanted spoken. Inside herself, she carried a storm of emotions she could not name. Shame forced upon her, terror of what was coming, grief for a body that had never truly belonged to her. She understood better than anyone that enslaved women were never allowed ownership over their own flesh, no matter their age. Her years had not earned her safety. They had only delayed the inevitable reminder of her powerlessness. As her condition became undeniable, she withdrew further into silence. She stopped singing softly while she worked. She stopped offering advice. At night, she pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling movements she prayed were not real. Each one felt like a sentence being written into history without her consent. She knew, deep down, that whatever happened next would not end with her. It would ripple outward, touching lives, reputations, and legacies. She had survived 72 years in bondage by enduring quietly. But now, her very existence had become a disturbance, one that Mississippi in 1854 was not prepared to confront. And the world that had ignored her for decades suddenly found itself staring at her body, forced to reckon with a truth it would rather deny. The plantation where she lived was not just a place of labor. It was a carefully controlled world built on silence, fear, and absolute authority. Every sound, every movement, every breath belonged to the enslaver. The land stretched wide across Mississippi soil, lined with cotton fields that seemed endless. But freedom did not exist anywhere within them. The big house stood elevated, watching everything below, a constant reminder of who held power and who did not. For the enslaved, there was no private life, no private body, no private suffering. Everything was subject to permission, punishment, and profit. Control on the plantation was not always loud. Sometimes it came through the crack of a whip, but more often it lived in routine. Bells dictated when people woke, worked, ate, and slept. Overseers counted bodies like inventory. Even rest was regulated. Illness was questioned, pain doubted, exhaustion dismissed. For enslaved women especially, the body was never considered their own. It was a resource, something to be used until it broke, then replaced or discarded. Age did not remove that reality. It only changed the way control was exercised. By the time she reached her 70s, the enslaver no longer viewed her as labor in the fields, But that did not mean she was free from his reach. She worked inside the house, where power operated more quietly and more intimately. Inside those walls, there were no witnesses. The same hands that commanded obedience in daylight could demand it again at night, without explanation and without consequence. Refusal was not an option. It never had been. Enslaved people understood that survival depended on submission, no matter how degrading or cruel the demand. The enslaver himself was an aging man, weakened by illness and aware that his time was running out. That awareness made him unpredictable. Power, when it begins to slip, often tightens its grip. He had lived his entire life without accountability, his authority reinforced by law, custom, and violence. The people around him were not human beings in his eyes. They were extensions of his will. Their bodies were property, and property could be used however the owner desired. The plantation reflected this mindset. Fear kept it functioning. Silence kept it stable. For enslaved women, pregnancy was both expected and exploited. Younger women were monitored, their fertility seen as economic value. Children meant more labor, more wealth. But an elderly woman's body was not supposed to produce life. That belief made her condition especially unsettling. It exposed something plantation society tried to keep hidden, that control over enslaved bodies was not about productivity alone. It was about domination. Her age did not protect her, because protection was never part of the system. Within the enslaved quarters, the environment was heavy with unspoken knowledge. People knew what happened in the big house, even when no one dared to describe it. Women shared warnings through glances, through coded language, through quiet advice passed from generation to generation. They knew that being inside help came with dangers different from the fields. Proximity to power did not mean safety, it meant vulnerability. The walls that sheltered enslavers also trapped those forced to serve within them. The plantation culture demanded absolute obedience, but it also demanded secrecy. Scandals threatened reputation, inheritance, and legacy. When something happened that could not be explained easily, it was buried under lies or forced silence. The enslaver's control extended beyond physical acts. It shaped the narrative. Doctors, overseers, even preachers were expected to align their explanations with whatever preserved the master's authority. Truth was not a priority, control was. When signs of her pregnancy became impossible to hide, the environment shifted. The same plantation that had ignored her for years suddenly became alert, watchful, tense. Her body was no longer invisible. It was a problem, a disruption, something that could not exist without raising questions no one wanted answered. The enslaver's control turned from quiet exploitation to aggressive management. She was watched more closely, isolated more deliberately. Decisions about her body were made without her presence, let alone her consent. Medical authority on the plantation did not serve the enslaved, it served the enslaver. Doctors were called not out of concern for her life, but to assess risk, to manage appearance, to determine how the situation could be contained. She was examined like an object, discussed like a curiosity, spoken about as if she were not in the room. Her age became a topic of disbelief, not empathy. No one asked how her body endured it. No one asked what she felt. The plantation environment allowed this to happen because it was designed for it. It normalized control so completely that even something as shocking as a 72-year-old enslaved woman carrying a child did not trigger outrage, only calculation. How would this affect the household, the inheritance, the public image? Her suffering was irrelevant. Her humanity was secondary to the system that owned her. In that world, the enslaver's control over her body was total, even at the edge of death. He dictated where she slept, who touched her, who examined her, and what story would eventually be told. The plantation did not see her as a victim of something unthinkable. It saw her as evidence of a problem to be managed. And in 1854, Mississippi, managing that problem mattered far more than confronting the cruelty that caused it. When the truth could no longer be avoided, disbelief spread through the plantation like a sickness. At first, no one wanted to say it aloud. The women who noticed the changes in her body exchanged frightened glances, whispering behind closed doors. Pregnancy at her age was not just rare, it was considered impossible. In a time when medical knowledge was limited but rigidly confident, women past a certain age were believed to be incapable of conceiving. Menopause was treated as a final boundary, an ending written into the natural order. What was happening to her did not fit any accepted explanation, and that alone made it dangerous. The first doctor summoned to examine her arrived with irritation rather than concern. He assumed exaggeration, perhaps illness or swelling from age. His hands were cold and impatient as he pressed against her abdomen, his brow tightening as the reality resisted his assumptions. He said little at first, asked questions no one could answer, and repeated the examination as if his own senses had betrayed him. When he finally stepped back, his face had lost its certainty. He requested privacy with the enslaver, something that had nothing to do with her well-being and everything to do with control. Word spread quickly through the household. Overseers whispered. Servants speculated. The enslaver's family reacted with shock mixed with anger, not at the suffering of an elderly woman, but at the embarrassment of the situation. A 72-year-old enslaved woman carrying a child threatened the illusion of order the plantation relied upon. It raised questions no one wanted to answer, about consent, about power, about how such a thing could even happen. Instead of compassion, the dominant reaction was fear of gossip, fear of scandal, fear of losing authority. More doctors were called. Each arrived with skepticism and left with unease. Some suggested tumors, others swelling of organs, anything that might preserve the belief that pregnancy was impossible. But the signs became undeniable. The movement, the growth, the rhythm of life beneath the skin. One physician reportedly said nothing at all, only shook his head and refused to sign any statement. Another suggested the matter be kept discreet, a word that carried more weight than truth ever did on a plantation. Among the enslaved community, the reaction was very different. Fear was mixed with dread and sorrow. The women understood exactly what this meant. They did not need medical textbooks to know that her body was fragile, worn down by decades of forced labor and neglect. Childbirth was dangerous even for the young and healthy. For someone her age, it was almost certainly a death sentence. They whispered prayers at night, not for miracles, but for mercy. Some believed the pregnancy was a sign of divine punishment upon the household. Others believed it was proof that there was no limit to what slavery could violate, not even nature itself. Religious figures were consulted, but their responses offered no clarity. Some claimed it was God's will, spoken without looking at the woman herself. Others suggested it was unnatural, even sinful, carefully avoiding the question of who had committed the sin. Responsibility was shifted, blurred, erased. The system protected itself. No one dared say the obvious truth aloud, that this was not a mystery of science, but a consequence of absolute power over another human being. The enslaver's reaction hardened as the reality set in. What had begun as disbelief turned into control. She was isolated, her movements restricted, her interactions monitored. Not to protect her, but to contain the situation. Decisions were made about her body without her presence. Doctors discussed her condition as if she were an object of study, not a person who could hear every word. Her pain, her fear, her consent, none of it mattered. What mattered was managing the narrative. Scientific language failed them, and that failure exposed the limits of their authority. Medicine in 1854 could explain many things, but it could not explain this in a way that preserved dignity or order. That uncertainty terrified the men who relied on certainty to justify their dominance. If science could not explain it, then it had to be controlled through silence. Records were kept vague. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered the room. The pregnancy became something spoken about only behind closed doors. For her, the reactions around her felt distant, muffled, unreal. She understood more than they realized. She saw the fear in the doctor's eyes, the tension in the enslaver's voice, the way people avoided looking at her directly. Her body had become a contradiction no one wanted to face. Each movement inside her felt like a countdown, not just to birth, but to whatever consequences would follow. She did not expect care. She did not expect justice. She only feared that the child growing within her would be born into the same silence that had consumed her life. The pregnancy challenged every rule the plantation believed it lived by. It defied medical certainty, exposed moral hypocrisy, and forced a confrontation with truths that could not be explained away. And instead of meeting that challenge with humanity, the system responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control, suppressing truth, and preparing to erase whatever could not be understood. The birth itself came quietly, without ceremony, without celebration, and without mercy. It happened in the early hours before dawn, when the plantation was at its most silent, as if even the land knew this was something not meant to be witnessed. She had been moved into a small room away from the main house, not for privacy or dignity, but for containment. The enslaver did not want questions. He did not want sounds carrying across the yard. What happened that night needed to stay hidden. Her labor was long and brutal. Her body, already worn thin by age and years of abuse, struggled against something it was never meant to endure again. The women who were forced to assist her could see the danger immediately. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Every contraction looked like it might be her last. They whispered prayers through clenched teeth, not knowing whether they were praying for her survival or for a swift end to the suffering. There was no doctor present at first. They had been told to wait. Even in that moment, her pain was secondary to control. When the cries became impossible to ignore, a physician was finally summoned, not in urgency for her life, but to ensure the outcome could be documented, managed, explained if necessary. He arrived with a tight jaw and averted eyes. The birth that followed defied everything he believed about the human body. Against expectation, against probability, a living child was delivered. Small, frail, but breathing. A boy. The room went silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if everyone present understood instantly that nothing would ever be the same again. She barely had the strength to look at him. Her body lay still, exhausted beyond anything she had known before. The women placed the child near her, unsure if she was even conscious. Her eyes opened slowly, clouded but aware. When she saw him, something crossed her face that could not be named: fear, sorrow, disbelief, and a quiet resignation. This child was not a miracle to her, he was proof. Proof of what had been done to her body long after it should have been left in peace. News of the birth spread through the plantation before sunrise. Despite every effort to suppress it, servants whispered, overseers stiffened. The enslaver was informed in private. Witnesses later described his reaction not as joy, but as calculation. This was his last son, born not of legitimacy or love, but of power exercised without consequence. He did not go to see the woman. He did not hold the child. Instead, he asked questions about the boy's health, about resemblance, about who knew and who did not. The child was acknowledged, but not publicly. Recognition would complicate things. Silence was safer. The consequences were immediate and cruel. She was not allowed to recover properly. Her body was weak, bleeding heavily, barely holding on. But her comfort did not matter. The focus shifted entirely to the child. Wet nurses were discussed. Living arrangements debated. The boy's future was considered in terms of property and inheritance, not kinship. She, meanwhile, was treated as though her role had already ended. Once the child was born, she was no longer necessary. Among the enslaved, the birth caused a deep fracture. Some saw the child as cursed, born from violence and secrecy. Others saw him as innocent, another life trapped by the same system. No one spoke openly, but the weight of it hung over the quarters like a storm cloud. An elderly woman giving birth was something they had never seen, something they believed nature itself resisted. Many feared she would not survive long after, and they were not wrong. Her health declined rapidly. Infection set in. Fever followed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out names from her past, sometimes reaching for the child when he was no longer there. She was allowed to see him only briefly. He was taken away quickly, moved closer to the big house, separated from her almost immediately. The bond between mother and child was treated as inconvenient, unnecessary, even dangerous. For the enslaver's household, the birth became a problem to solve. How would the boy be classified? How would his existence be explained if questions arose? He was a son, but not one that fit neatly into the social order. Acknowledging him meant acknowledging her, and acknowledging her meant confronting the reality of what had been done. So the solution was half measures and silence. He was neither fully hidden nor fully claimed. He existed in a limbo that mirrored the circumstances of his birth. She died not long after, quietly, without ceremony, without record beyond a brief mention of decline due to age. There was no acknowledgement that childbirth had taken what little strength she had left. Her death was treated as inevitable, convenient even. Another old enslaved woman gone. But those who knew the truth carried it with them. They remembered that she did not simply die of age. She died because her body had been used until it finally failed. The birth of the enslaver's last son left a scar on the plantation that never healed. It unsettled the household, disrupted inheritance, and introduced a child whose very existence challenged the lies the system depended on. For the woman who gave birth at 72, there was no justice, no recognition, no peace. Only the quiet knowledge that even at the very end of her life, her body had never truly been her own. The legacy of what happened did not end with her death, because systems built on cruelty rarely allow clean endings. The child she brought into the world grew up under a shadow that could never be lifted, shaped from the moment of his birth by silence, contradiction, and fear. He was alive because of a system that denied humanity, and he was trapped by that same system before he could speak. No one celebrated his milestones. No one marked his birth openly. He existed as a reminder of something the plantation wanted forgotten, but could never fully erase. Within the household, his presence complicated everything. He was blood, yet not family in any way that society would accept. He carried the enslaver's lineage, yet none of its protection. The law defined him not by his father, but by his mother's status, which meant that despite being the enslaver's last son, he was still considered property. That contradiction haunted the plantation. Every time someone looked at him, they saw proof that the rules were designed not for justice, but for control. As he grew, questions followed him like a curse. Why did the master show interest but never affection? Why was the boy kept close yet never acknowledged? Why were some privileges granted quietly, while others were denied harshly? Overseers treated him differently, sometimes with caution, sometimes with resentment. Enslaved people watched him with a mixture of pity and fear. They understood that children born of such circumstances rarely escape tragedy. Too visible to be ignored, too inconvenient to be protected, he lived in a fragile space where one wrong moment could erase him completely. Stories about his mother were not told openly, but they survived in fragments. Whispers passed between women while working, half-finished sentences spoken only when no one else was near. They remembered her age, her pain, the way she had been taken from the world quietly after giving everything she had left. To them, the boy was not a miracle or a curiosity. He was a living wound. Every time they saw him, they were reminded of how far slavery could reach, how it could violate even the boundaries of nature and age without consequence. The enslaver's death brought no relief. In fact, it made the boy's situation more dangerous. With the master gone, there was no longer even a twisted sense of obligation protecting him. Inheritance discussions turned tense. White relatives argued over land, wealth, and legacy, and the boy's existence became a problem to be resolved. Some wanted him sold quietly to avoid scandal. Others wanted him kept hidden, working the fields where his face would not raise questions. His fate was debated without his presence, without anyone asking what would become of him as a human being. In the years that followed, the plantation itself changed. The Civil War loomed, bringing chaos, fear, and uncertainty. Power structures began to crack, but they did not disappear overnight. For the boy, freedom did not arrive as a clear moment of liberation. Even when laws shifted, the damage had already been done. He had grown up learning to stay quiet, to observe, to survive by being invisible. Trauma shaped him as much as chains ever could. The broader legacy reached beyond one plantation. Stories like his were rarely written down, but they existed across the South, hidden beneath official records that spoke of property and labor instead of violence and coercion. His mother's story challenged everything the system claimed to stand for. It exposed the lie that slavery was orderly or moral. It revealed how deeply power could corrupt, how completely it could strip people of autonomy, dignity, and safety, even at the very end of life. For historians, such stories are difficult to trace because they were never meant to survive. Records were vague by design. Ages were altered. Relationships erased. Deaths explained away. But memory does not need ink to endure. The enslaved carried these truths with them, passing them down through oral history, through warnings, through a collective understanding that slavery was not just about labor, but about absolute control over the body and the future. The woman who gave birth at 72 was never given a grave that marked her suffering, but her story stands as an indictment of the system that consumed her. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that violence does not always look dramatic, that evil often hides behind routine, and that the most disturbing acts are sometimes treated as ordinary by those in power. Her life and death remind us that history is not only shaped by famous names and battles, but by the countless silenced voices whose pain was considered acceptable. The child she left behind became part of that legacy, whether he wanted to or not. His existence challenged the laws, beliefs, and justifications of his time. He stood as living evidence that slavery was willing to break every moral and natural boundary to preserve itself. And even now, long after the plantation has faded into history, the story remains unsettling because it asks a question that still matters: how many lives were destroyed, rewritten, or forgotten simply because a system decided they were not human enough to matter? What followed after everything else was a deliberate erasure, as calculated as the control that had defined her life. The official records did not tell her story. Plantation logs reduced her existence to numbers and vague phrases, marking her death as ordinary, expected, unremarkable. There was no mention of childbirth, no acknowledgement of the strain placed on a body already near its end. Ages were softened or omitted, circumstances blurred, truth buried beneath language designed to protect reputations rather than lives. History, as written by those in power, closed its eyes and moved on. This silence was not accidental. It was necessary for the system to survive. Acknowledging what had happened would have meant admitting that slavery was not simply harsh labor, but total domination that ignored age, health, and humanity. It would have forced uncomfortable questions about consent, morality, and the abuse of authority. Instead, the plantation culture relied on forgetting. Forgetting became a skill practiced daily. What could not be justified was ignored. What could not be explained was erased. Among the enslaved, forgetting was impossible. Memory lived on in quieter ways. It lived in warnings whispered to young girls about the dangers of proximity to power. It lived in the way elderly women were watched with protective concern, as if the community understood that age alone did not guarantee safety. It lived in the collective knowledge that the system had no boundaries, that even the most basic assumptions about nature and dignity could be violated without consequence. These memories were not written, but they were carried, heavy and persistent. Generations later, the absence of records would confuse historians and descendants alike. Gaps in dates, contradictions in ages, unexplained children appearing in inventories. These were the fingerprints of deliberate omission. The lack of documentation was not proof that something did not happen. It was proof that someone worked very hard to make sure it would be difficult to prove. The silence itself became evidence. The moral weight of her story lies not only in what was done to her, but in how easily it was dismissed. the system did not collapse under the horror of her experience. It continued functioning, producing cotton, enforcing obedience, and maintaining the illusion of order. That normalcy is what makes the story so disturbing. There was no uprising, no reckoning, no moment where power paused to reflect. Life on the plantation went on, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, because cruelty had been normalized to the point where even the unimaginable could be absorbed without disruption. This kind of silence has consequences that extend far beyond one life. It shapes how societies remember themselves. When stories like hers are excluded, history becomes sanitized, incomplete, and misleading. Slavery is reduced to an abstract injustice rather than a lived reality that invaded every stage of life, including old age and death. The emotional and physical violence becomes harder to grasp, easier to distance from, easier to minimize. Her story challenges that comfort. It refuses to stay neatly contained within dates and locations. It forces us to confront the fact that systems of oppression do not operate only through laws and whips, but through routine, entitlement, and the belief that some bodies exist solely for the use of others. It reminds us that extreme cruelty often hides behind ordinary days and unremarkable records. There is also an uncomfortable truth in how long it took for stories like hers to surface. For decades, they were dismissed as exaggerations or anomalies. Only when scholars began listening more closely to oral histories, to patterns rather than isolated facts, did the fuller picture emerge. Even now, many such stories remain untold, locked away in lost records or memories that were never passed on. Her experience represents countless others whose names will never be known, whose suffering was considered too inconvenient to acknowledge. Remembering her is not about shock value. It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that history is shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed. Her life forces a reckoning with the idea that survival alone does not equal justice, and that death without acknowledgement is a second kind of violence. She was denied agency in life, and then denied recognition in death. By confronting stories like this, we challenge the silence that allowed them to happen. We refuse the version of history that smooths over pain in favor of comfort. Her story matters not because it is rare, but because it exposes the depth of what was considered acceptable. It stands as a reminder that humanity can be stripped away gradually, quietly, and with devastating efficiency when power goes unchecked. In the end, the true legacy of her life is not found in records or dates, but in the questions her story forces us to ask. Who gets remembered and who is erased? Whose suffering is documented and whose is dismissed? And how many truths remain buried simply because acknowledging them would require us to confront the darkest parts of our past?